week 11 and week 1 of InDesign. InDesign is fundamentally different than the two programs we've worked with up to now, in that InDesign is a design program, whereas the other two were fundamentally image creation programs. Now, I think I told the group back at the beginning that it was kind of an arbitrary decision which we started out with, whether it was Photoshop or Illustrator. It's not particularly advantageous to do one of those before the other, but it is very specific that we are doing InDesign last, because you will often, as a working designer, if that's where you're headed, find yourself creating images or assets, they're sometimes referred to, in Illustrator or in Photoshop, or manipulating them in one of those programs, and then bringing them into design, where they will be placed with text, or on a website, of course. A lot of the images I create in Photoshop end up on a website, but a fair number of them end up in print as well. So InDesign is going to feel somewhat like Illustrator for you, but it does some things that are quite a bit different in some ways. So what is it good for? Well, the first thing I'd have to say is typography. And by the way, we are looking at the Essentials workspace right now, which is a very dumbed down version of what InDesign can be. And so I recommend, as I did with the other two programs, that you switch to either Advanced or Typography, and I think I will switch to Advanced. And now you'll see an interface that's quite a bit more similar to what we have worked with in the other two programs, in which we have the menus on the tools on the left and the menus on the other side. And you'll also note that we have information up here, things you can enter up here that are dependent on the tool you are in. So if I select this box, information about this frame is populated, but if I switch to the type tool, the information up here becomes quite a bit more typography related. So the first thing InDesign is good for is typography. Now, I'm going to show you an example of a style sheet in a minute. Style sheets are a way of enforcing consistency across type design, and they have other uses too in InDesign. But I'll just switch back to Illustrator for a moment. And Illustrator actually allows you to create a style sheet. And here's sort of the start of one. And here's all the categories of information that you can program into that style sheet. So for example, basic character formats like the name of the font family, the font style, the size you want it to be, all those kinds of basic things. And there are, let's see, I think 10 categories that you can program into a Illustrator style sheet. So you can create an Illustrator style sheet in, let's cancel, in that program. But if we switch back to InDesign, and I was to create a style sheet, let's just say new paragraph style, well, you see a whole lot more categories of things you could build into that style sheet. So we have general basic character formats, but we also have just a whole bunch of other categories of things that you can program into a style sheet that you might use to enforce a consistent look across different branded pieces, or to make sure that your magazine looks the same or has a family resemblance or is on brand with your magazine every month. That kind of thing that you can build into it. And some of these are more focused on little type, text type, and having control and getting beautiful just text. Some of these are more focused on big type like headlines, but there's just a whole lot more you can build into your InDesign paragraph styles. You have just a lot more power over your typography in this program than you do in either Photoshop or Illustrator. The next thing that this does that the other two programs really don't is long form documents. And nearly every book, every magazine, every newspaper you see is designed in InDesign. There are some notable exceptions to that. There are a couple competing products such as Quark Express. Some bigger newspapers use a proprietary system that builds pages and also is used for the website. I think the Washington Post does that for most of their pages, but if they're doing something complex, they're probably doing it in InDesign. Just sort of simple layouts. They might be doing something else. But InDesign is also used for EPUBs. So if you download a book to your tablet, that was also probably originally created in InDesign. InDesign gives you a lot of tools for building a long form document. For example, automatic page numbering and a few other things. So I have a document I designed about a year ago now, just to look at it. And this is an InDesign document, of course, and it is multiple pages. Now, there are two things that this does that is not really possible in the other two programs. One is this text is all linked and all designed to flow. So if, let's imagine I wanted to add a picture to the top of this column, I could drag this column down, and you can see the text flowing throughout the document. In fact, if I select all this text, it is all part of one continuous flow of text. And that makes working with text and manipulating text across a range of pages much, much easier, and in fact possible. So I don't have to worry about where this text begins and ends. I just have to make sure it all fits. I can change my mind about a picture, I can remove a picture, and this text is just going to flow wherever I want it. I sometimes think of this as being sort of like when you're approaching a page, this is like a stream sort of flowing around these permanently fixed objects like rocks to develop a layout. The other thing InDesign has that the other two programs don't really have is what are called master pages. And master pages allow you to have things like page elements that repeat throughout a document. So you'll note that class notes is on every single one of these pages. And that is, I probably should double check that, but yep, here it is. It is actually on this master page. And if I want to create a new page and bring it down, then I see these sort of permanent elements, including these rules. That's kind of an ornate way of presenting a column, is to put a rule between it. It makes it look a little bit more elegant. Most columns don't have rules. These columns don't have rules, for example. And those are the sort of things that can appear on your master page. The other thing that appears on this master page is a page number, and that has been updated automatically to follow the page numbers on these pages. So InDesign is really focused on multiple page documents and making things like page numbering and that sort of thing automatic and easy. And it's not just style sheets that are more complex. If we were to go into all of these programs, allow for a certain amount of customization of your interface and how you work. And InDesign, if we were to go into its preferences, so many of these are about typography. Now, the other thing you can do with your master page that's populated throughout this is you can have guidelines. So let's go to View. And switch my screen mode back to normal. And now you can see some of the guides that are all on these pages. And that makes things like making this would be called a grid. And this would be called a 4-column grid because it has 4 regular columns. And that just makes designing something like this, where you have a repeating grid and you want probably the same margins across pages. You want that sort of consistency through these pages throughout this document. It helps you create it consistently and on brand. And so, and here are the grid lines. So if I were to come in and let me just delete this column so I'll get some text. So I'm going to click here, and that's grouped columns, so I'm just going to ungroup those. So I can click on this little outbox, and then I can click here, and it creates a new text frame, and it fits it to that column automatically. There are other ways to do this. You can have one text frame that has multiple columns in it, but that's just a matter of how you enjoy working, and sometimes I do it one way, honestly, and sometimes I do it the other. Now, the other thing, let's just go back to my previous document. The other thing, which we will not have time to get into in this course with just 5 weeks to look at InDesign, but it's good to know it's there, is InDesign really does interactivity. And the other two programs we've looked at this semester don't do that. So for example, a PDF could have working hyperlinks. A PDF could have a table of contents that lets you go from the article title on the table of contents to the actual article within the document. And it actually goes beyond that. You can build little animations in InDesign. You can have you could make an app. Some of the magazines do this. They do app versions of their magazine, and in addition to the pictures and the words that a printed magazine would have, they might have embedded videos, or they might have things that let you scroll around a 3D view, or these sort of little interactive features. You cannot get that directly from InDesign, but you can do that in conjunction with InDesign and in conjunction with a couple of other things. And you can also preview all that with the Publish Online feature, and you can see that up here. If I built some interactivity into this, or even if I didn't like it, at Publish Online, and it would create a working version of my interactive document in InDesign. So that's really what makes InDesign different. Now, the challenge for you, or I would guess most students in this class, is most of these features are really going to be irrelevant to you until you know InDesign a little bit better. Typography is, you have a whole lot of control over typography, but you have to want that control, you have to be able to see typography and see the flaws in typography a little bit more than most of you, in my experience with students at your stage, are really capable of doing. So, for example, this piece of type here, I see a lot of problems with it, and I could start to fix it by, let's say, making it a little bit tighter. And I'm going to show you how to do this yourself in a minute, but just for the sake of expediency, I'm just going to tighten that up. And you can do that in the other programs as well, but InDesign can be set up so that it gives you finer control. And I can have a lot of control over how my typography is set. But little things like the spacing between letters is probably not something that you notice much at this point. It's also possible to have this in a column of text. Let's go back to that's the wrong document. Let's go back to this one. So this is what's called justified text, and this is very even in color. It's got a nice smooth tone, but if there were big gaps or holes in this, let's just switch this to something else. Let's just say basic paragraph, and let's justify it. Do that. So now this is different, and we're seeing sort of big spaces between the words and big gaps. That's the sort of thing that You might notice it after I point it out to you, but you would probably not notice it on your own. You have to become sensitized to typography to really develop an appreciation of InDesign's powers in this area. So it's going to seem for you like a lot like Illustrator at this point. And indeed, like Illustrator, it's a vector-based program. But part of what we're doing, or this semester, is sort of the starting of the process of getting you sensitized to typography, and then you'll get even more sensitized when you take typography itself next semester if you're headed into that direction, and even more sensitized as you continue on throughout the design program. So right now, InDesign is going to seem a little bit useless, but it's because it's what it's good at is going to become important later on. And also, I'm not going to ask you to do a long form document this semester, because that would just be a little bit too daunting at your current skill level, or at least the skill level that you're expected to be at, unless some of you have been on school newspapers or school magazines or yearbooks or that kind of thing. So some of you have probably done that, but for most of you, trying to design a multi-page document that is consistent and is of a piece is just too big a project right now. So the thing about InDesign is it's really good at this stuff, but it's going to seem more frustrating. And why do I need to use a new program when everything I'm doing I could have done in Illustrator? Well, you're doing it. You're setting the bed now for the progress you're going to make later on, and that progress will be with typography and with the ability to do long, branded, consistent documents in the most efficient way possible. Now, some of you, if you go on to design careers, will never use InDesign because most of what you do will be headed for the web. But for those of you who are headed for any kind of print career, or a career that includes some print, and I think most design jobs probably still include some print, at least some print, InDesign will be the primary program that you will use. So what I'm going to ask you to do is something similar to what we've done before, is to just create, an aphorism or design a quote. So to do this, I'm going to start a new document. Just taking a minute to come up. And like the other interfaces, it gives you some options for creating a document. You can also create a custom document. Oh, and I should explain that my measurement system is picas. I prefer them because, for a couple of reasons, I think they give you a little bit more control, and they're a little bit more intuitive once you get used to them. Of course, they're not intuitive until you know what they are, but picas is the standard unit of measurement for typography. So since really almost the beginning of typography, that is the unit that typesetters have talked in. But if we switch this to inches, we could see this is a standard 11.5 by 8.5 document. I can give it a orientation of vertical or horizontal, just like all of the other programs. But what's different about InDesign is I can also give it that structure that I showed you. And I'm just going to do this. You don't have to this time. I'm just going to give it a 3-column structure. Oh, it's going to be horizontal, so maybe I'll give it a 4-column structure. You can give it margins. And you can also plan for it to have to go over the edge of the page. That's what a bleed is, but I'm not going to worry about bleed right now. And so I'll just create a document, and there's that structure, and that's how that structure was created. I can change this structure after the fact, but you can also create it when you create a document. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a text frame, and I'm going to retrieve a quote that I found earlier, and you can feel free to create to find a quote, or you can have, if there's an aphorism you want to use or anything like that, that's fine. And I am going to paste it into this frame, and I'm going to make it bigger. So let's just make sure we have it all, or maybe I'll just say Command A. Whoop. So I can make it bigger by clicking on, this is the size, and you can see a little sort of scaled type, and I can, the biggest I can make it is 72, but we can make it a bigger than that manually. I could make it 100. And I can change the typeface. I think I'll choose Publico Headline and bold. This is not a font you will likely have. And this is a font that is optimized for big sizes. In fact, we can put it in Publico Banner, which is even more optimized for use at large sizes. And how do I know that? Well, A, because that's how it was sold to me, but B, if we were to zoom in on one of these letters, it's very high contrast between the thin parts and the thick parts of the letter. A font that is designed to be used at smaller sizes is just a little bit sturdier. In fact, we can make another O, just for comparison. And we can just put this in Publico Text. And you can see the contrast between the thin and the thick part is just not nearly as extreme. And that's so that it holds up when it's printed at smaller sizes. So if you want a font that is like this, a free font that you can use that's optimized for display, that's a pretty good font, it's called Playfair, and you can find that on the internet at Font Squirrel and at other places. So this is now too big, so let's just, for the time being, let's take this down to 72 again, I guess. And let's work with that. So I want to make this into a pretty piece of typography, and I think I don't want my grids in this case to distract me because I'm not really using the grid, so I'm just going to hit my W key to get rid of that, to view. They're still there, but I just can't see them. I'm in something closer to a preview mode. And so I want to make this a little bit prettier. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do, is to find a quote or an aphorism and just make it a little bit prettier. Now, there are a couple things I want to do. One is this came with a hyphen, and it really should have a typographer's dash. And that would be an M dash. I'll include this key command. This is true in every program. This is a type thing, not an InDesign thing. So it works everywhere, but if I hold down my Option and Shift key and the hyphen button, I get an M dash rather than that hyphen, and that's how it should be. And according to most style books, there should not be space around it. So one of the things I tell students is that as you get into typography, you start worrying less about the fonts you're using. I mean, you're not picking fonts like Comic Sans or fonts that have huge amounts of personality, but you are worried more about the spaces around the fonts. And that means the spaces between lines and the spaces between letters. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to reduce the spaces between lines. When you look at this 72, you'll see right below it something that is controlling the space between lines of type. And that's called leading. And that's a typographer's term that goes back to the early days of type, because if you wanted to spread type out, back when type was cast as pieces of metal, you had to put a thin strip of lead between those lines. You had to lead it out with a strip of lead, and that lead would be, however many points wide it is. And you can see that should have kept to picas, but we can switch back to that under preferences. Let's just switch this back to, well, let's switch it to points in this case. So this is telling us that it is 86 points, and that refers to the distance between the bottom of this line of type, not where the G goes, but the baseline where most of the letters rest upon, and the baseline below it. And so this box I drew, we can see is, well, I didn't draw it exactly, but pretty close to the actual leading in this. Now the other thing to observe, let's just delete that box now, is that this measurement is in parentheses, and that means that this is automatic leading. So when I make the type a little bit bigger, this number is going up. InDesign is automatically making the space between lines a little bit bigger when I make the type a little bit bigger. And when you're a serious typographer, you want to control that yourself. And I was just using my key commands to make that type bigger. And if you hold down Shift and Command or Control on a PC, and you hit your caret keys, so above the period, the caret above the period is making it bigger, and the caret above the comma is making it smaller. And as you get more efficient with the software, you'll find yourself relying on the keyboard commands more and more. So this 20%, it's basically 20%. It could be anything else. That's one of the things you can control in preferences, is pretty good for text type. That's pretty standard for text type, but it's a little bit loose for headlines or for big type, which this is. So I am going to change it to, well, let's try 70. Let's just make it 70, the same as the size. And to me, that looks much more compact, and it has a little bit more impact that way. So I think I like it 70, but sometimes you'll even see headlines, especially really short headlines, actually let it less than the size of the font. And we can do this until the lines of type start crashing into each other. But I probably don't want that. I want to return it to 70. And in this case, I'm using the key command again, which is just Option or Alt on a PC, and your up and down arrows. If you want to do that automatically, you can also type it in here. Let's make that 70. And you can also go to your drop down, and we can switch it back to auto, or we can make it one of the pre-selected numbers. So the other thing I think I want to do is I want to change the font that's in so it contrasts with the quote. Let's say these are the fonts I use for that magazine I showed you. So that looks pretty nice to me. Now the other place where you might want to think about space is between letters. So this font, as you can see, sets quite a bit tighter. It's not perfect. If we zoom in on this, it sets quite a bit tighter than this. This is really very loose by default. And this is the way the type designer wanted it, but I want it to blend in a little bit more with this font. So I am going to alter the space between these letters. And these are so loose that I'm going to do it to all of these at once. And that is called tracking if you're a typographer. And here is where it is. So you can see that this is showing me a bunch of letters and it's controlling the space between them. And you can, in practice, use these two things. I'm going to show you the other one in a minute interchangeably. But let's tighten this up. Let's say -25, -50. This is really quite a bit loose. And this is really just a matter of eye and experience, how tight something could get. I would not do, if we did the same thing to this font, if we made it -75, all of a sudden that's way too tight. So when you think about spacing and letters, you have to think in terms of the individual typeface we're looking at. But for this, I think that's good. Now you can also tighten the space between individual characters, and that's what's referred to as kerning. And so we could do that here. We can say -75. And that's just a screen anomaly for a minute, and that looks a little bit better. Now, the other thing about kerning is, and this I want you to, spend a little bit of time doing, don't go crazy, is that letters are designed to go next to every letter. Every letter is designed with a little bit of space within it, but a V might be next to an L, it might be next to a B, rarely, but it's going to be next to an A. It's going to be next to a bunch of different letters. And because of that, the space is often uneven. Even in the most beautifully designed typefaces, the space is often a little bit uneven within a word. And that is, just because those letters have to be flexible. But when you are looking at an exact word, you don't have to put up with that inconsistent spacing. So here you can see the R looks a little bit closer to the Y, and the E looks, it's okay next to the R, and the V, because of its slanted sides, looks quite a bit distant from the E's on either side of it. So we can put our cursor between there, and we can kern that a little bit tighter. And if you're working with a bunch of letters, that's tracking, but if you're working with an individual letter, that's kerning. And so I could go back here and I can say -50, or I could type in like -57. Or I can use the key command, the same one for tracking, is I can hold down my Option or Alt key and my left arrow key, I can just put it a little bit closer. Now, when I did this, let's do this again. Just move that R like a little bit closer. So what it happened is it set it for -20, and that's what InDesign does by default. And if you want to go exploring, there are ways of giving yourself finer control when you're using the key commands, or if the 20 is just too big, you can use the key command to get it in the ballpark and just change it to something that's a little bit different. But I tend to, in my documents, I tend to use the key commands, and I tend to have my settings set for finer control. So I would say don't go crazy, but pick a quote or an aphorism and design it to look a little bit prettier than it just did with the type when it came out of your computer. Think a little bit about the spacing, and that means the spacing between lines and the spacing between letters. And just make it a bit nicer than it would be just out of the box. A lot of times typographers use that when they talk about type and how it just sets. Nicer than it would be out of the box. And sometimes you have to put a break or sometimes you have a hyphen. None of these words hyphenate it, but sometimes you have to bring a word down to eliminate a hyphen. That could be something that can make type a little bit prettier too at display sizes if it's not full of broken words at the end of lines. So that's the assignment. It could be anything you want, and just make it look a little bit nicer. The other thing I think I'm going to do is I'm just going to center this in its box so it's on the center of the page. So for that, I'm going to go to Object, Text Frame Options, and I'm going to align this type centered in the box so it sort of is more even on the page. And if I wanted to, I could just move that over too, and I'm just nudging it with the arrow key, but you can pick it up with your mover key as well.